Well, thank you very much, Joe. Is this coming out okay? Am I enunciating and projecting okay? Very happy to be here, as always. And I see a person there that I'm very happy to see as well. Very happy to be here, and so glad to see you all came out tonight. And I'd like to just go into a subject that I've spent quite some time researching and putting my own little fingerprint on. So hopefully you'll enjoy it. But first, what I want to do is, with Halloween almost here, it reminds me that Mark Twain loved ghost stories. So I thought I'd start off with a strange but true ghost story that isn't widely known about Twain. One involving psychics, Ouija boards, and one of humanity's deepest, darkest mysteries, copyright law. The saga begins in 1915 when a psychic named Emily Hutching claimed that Mark Twain, now 5 years dead, channeled a book to her through a Ouija board. According to Hutching, Twain's first book to be published from beyond the grave was entitled Jap Heron, a novel written from the Ouija board. It was about a newspaper editor, something innocuous like that. Strange choice for Twain to make from beyond the grave. And not surprisingly, several publishing houses rejected the book outright, but a New York publisher with a flair for the odd released it in 1917. Reviews were not kind. The New York Times said, "If this is the best that Mark Twain can do by reaching across the barrier, the admirers that his works have won for him will all hope that he will hereafter respect that boundary." And not only was Twain's spectral publishing debut dead on arrival, his surviving daughter Clara and publisher Harper and Brothers sued Hutching and her publisher for violating their copyright on the name Mark Twain. The suit, as a tongue-in-cheek New York Times article reported in 1918, apparently had far-reaching implications beyond mere copyright infringement, such as questions over whether spirit communication with the living is demonstrable and whether there is a life hereafter. The article goes on to say the riddle of the universe is about to be debated, but not by theologians, but by lawyers. As if that prospect wasn't terrifying enough, the ethereal questions related to the cosmic riddle included, again from the New York Times article, has the shade of Samuel Clemens any right to use a pseudonym he adopted in the flesh and permitted his publishers to copyright? Well, unfortunately, the lawsuit had a very anticlimactic ending. No existential conundrums were resolved, and Twain's spirit gave no ghostly testimony from the netherworld. Instead, Hutching and the publisher had to withdraw the book and destroyed all the remaining copies. Yet, rumor has it that the book still lives on. It's difficult to dig up a hard copy these days, but when the Wi-Fi connection is just right and you're consulting those high-tech Ouija boards known as Google Search and ChatGPT, brave souls have been known to conjure up virtual copies of this book that still haunts the internet to this day. Pretty scary, huh? Well, after all that, I think, yes. So that was Twain from beyond the grave. But now for the disclaimer. Persons hoping to learn anything more about Ouija boards in this presentation will be prosecuted. Persons hoping to see me conjure up Mark Twain's spirit tonight from beyond his grave in Woodlawn Cemetery will be banished. And persons hoping to find the definitive religious biography of Twain in my book will be disappointed. Unlike the psychic Emily Hutching, I don't claim to have any otherworldly insight into something as elusive as this innermost spiritual life of Samuel Clemens. However, I have spent a large part of my life studying Mark Twain's writings and life, and I have developed a more theologically positive take on his religious views than the one that still stubbornly persists today. So it's my hope that my take on his religious beliefs will continue the ongoing conversation about who Mark Twain was and what this enduring icon still means to us. Okay, so what is the book about? Well, it's about 400 pages, and it took me about 30 years to write. I'm an independent scholar, and I have a non-academic day job, and believe me, it would have taken me much longer to get this book done had it not been for the generous encouragement of the Center for Mark Twain Studies. So I'm very much indebted to all that they've helped me do in terms of bringing this project finally to publication. And so I encourage you to continue supporting this wonderful place. But as far as my journey with this, how it began, was I took a Twain class at Georgetown University. It was a master's level course, and it went into a lot more depth than what the usual undergrad class that I had had in American literature or whatever went into. And I was personally very interested in Twain and religion, that we went into in much more depth. We never went into this in some of the other classes that I had had. And I learned that for decades after his death, in 1910, the scholarly consensus was that Twain was a mocking religious skeptic, if not an outright atheist. However, as I read Twain's own works, I found myself disagreeing with that consensus, even when I read his last completed novella entitled Number 44, The Mysterious Stranger. Now, ironically, Twain's Mysterious Stranger, whatever version you might know, remains the main source scholars will cite as evidence of his icy resignation to atheism and nihilism at the end of his life. There's a long, convoluted history around the mysterious stranger that would take me all night to untangle, so I'm not going to bother, but the overly simplified version is that the mysterious stranger, a romance, was posthumously published in 1916, and to my knowledge, no Ouija boards were used. It's a rather dark tale, though, and it's about a stranger claiming to be Satan's nephew, and he reveals to the young narrator a very somber insight. Nothing exists. It's all a dream. God, man, the world, the sun, the moon, the wilderness of stars, a dream, all a dream. They have no existence. So, understandably, critics took this bleak conclusion as Twain's despondent final statement on life until the early 1960s, when scholar John Tuckey discovered that this version was not exactly Twain's intended version. Basically, Twain's literary executor, Albert Bigelow Paine, patched together two different drafts Twain wrote late in life. There was the bleaker version, and it was unfinished, and it was called Chronicle of Young Satan. And Twain began that in the aftermath of his daughter Susie's death. So you can understand it would have more of a somber, darker tone to it, perhaps. And then there was the quirky, arguably more upbeat version that he completed in 1909. It was finished, and it was called Number 44, The Mysterious Stranger. The two versions tell somewhat similar stories, but there are crucial differences, and the biggest difference is in the Chronicle of Young Satan, as the title implies, the stranger is Satan, or related to Satan. In Number 44, he's not identified as satanic at all. And in fact, I kind of see him as just the opposite, as we'll get into later. But overlooking these differences, Paine attached the conclusion of Number 44 to the unfinished Young Satan. And this bogus version has cast a long shadow over our understanding of Twain's final decade, especially leaving us with the impression that Twain was bitterly nihilistic in the end, a view that was actually reflected in a claymation overview of Twain's works. That's a still from it there. And although this claymation animation was aimed at kids, if you've ever seen it, it's from the 1980s. The part about the mysterious stranger is very, very creepy, very unsettling. It was so creepy, in fact, that some critics have actually warned parents that it may be too disturbing for children to watch. Well, the main thesis of my book challenges this bleak view of Twain's later years and his life in general when it comes to religion. To begin to understand how, you have to understand that I also believe that throughout his career as a humorist, Twain saw himself as something of a preacher. Instead of preaching from what he called the drowsy pulpit of a church, Twain saw popular culture as a more effective way to reach more people with what he calls here in this quote from 1871, the gospel of Christ. Now, at this time, Twain was still, in my opinion, Christian. He was a Christian of some sort. However, even as he eventually moved beyond Christianity, Twain would always see himself as something of a preacher, as we'll see. And he preached what he called in number 44, God's real message. Now, seeing Twain in this preacherly way, I have a more theologically positive interpretation of Twain's works, even number 44, with its conclusion that nothing exists. In fact, I see the novella as the culmination of his lifelong engagement with religious liberalism. In my book, I trace a significant yet often overlooked thread woven throughout Twain's life that ties together the influence of a number of liberal religious movements of his time in his career as a humorist. Christianity, as I mentioned, but different stripes of that. Evangelical liberalism, Unitarianism, Universalism, they were all in some way playing a factor in his development. Freemasonry, he was a Freemason for much of the 1860s. And Emersonian free religion, which includes aspects of esoteric Hinduism. Emerson, of course, brought to our attention as a Western culture a lot of the writings from ancient Hindu philosophy. Now, I'm not the first to acknowledge that that the influence of liberal Christianity was on Twain, but most scholars mention it only in passing, or they tend to isolate it to the early years of his marriage to Olivia Langdon. I see the influence as being much larger than the liberal Christianity that he encountered here in Elmira through Olivia. I see it spanning throughout Twain's lifetime, in fact, even in the so-called pessimism of his final decade. To show this, tonight I'll give an overview of 3 key aspects of Twain's theological development that I see through this lens. It's the first half of Twain's life when he was involved with various forms of liberal Christianity. There's the latter half of his life where he was more drawn toward free religion. And the thread tying them together is his ever-evolving belief in God. So, what do I mean by liberal religion? We were talking a little bit before the talk began tonight about, the term is, in these fractious political times, very loaded, seems very loaded. And I'm not talking about anything involving our current culture wars or anything like that. Liberal religion, as I am talking about it, basically emerged out of the Enlightenment. It placed scripture and religious tradition under rigorous analytical scrutiny. This caused skeptics to dismiss Christianity as a myth and believers to double down on Orthodox tradition. The liberal Christians wanted to develop a progressive middle path between atheistic rationalism and authority-based religious tradition. Consequently, according to Unitarian Christian minister James Freeman Clarke, whom Twain knew and read, liberal Christians were drawn to two forms of Christianity emerging in the 19th century. They wanted to keep their ancient religious faith claims vital and relevant in a modern world that was being rocked by Darwinism and the scientific and industrial revolutions, by turning to liberal and rational Christianity, as Freeman Clarke names them. In contrast to the individual conforming to traditional Orthodox views of Christianity handed down over the centuries, liberal theologians advocated freedom in religion, not in a subjective my truth versus your truth way that we do today, but in a way where Christians who were Christians, founded in their Christian faith, were still encouraged to seek truth everywhere, even beyond boundaries of religious orthodoxy. And perhaps the most important traits that I have highlighted here tonight are the primacy of the individual's direct experience of the divine over any church or human authority. That was one big part of liberal religion at that time. And testing one's belief by the light of reason. Now, broadly speaking, liberalism in 19th century America was a spectrum offering different shades of theology, ranging from that end over there, the evangelical Christians who were open to liberal reforms like Lyman Beecher was, while remaining steadfastly devout Christians. Twain's friends Thomas Beecher at Park Church and Joe Twitchell in Hartford were examples of this kind of liberal Christian, in my opinion. Many Unitarians were enlightened liberal Christians, like Thomas Jefferson claimed to be, open to discarding outdated doctrines, customs, and superstitions while accepting what was left, keeping the vital part of it, retaining what was good and true about it. Theodore Parker was influential on Unitarian ministers Twain knew on the Western frontier, like the hugely popular Thomas Starr King, whom Twain would befriend in California during the Civil War. But there were also theological radicals who moved beyond even the liberal Christianity of Unitarianism and followed in the footsteps of Thomas Paine in leaving Christianity behind altogether, such as Ralph Waldo Emerson and his protege and close friend of Twain, Moncure Conway. So what does any of this have to do with Mark Twain, the alleged atheist? Aside from his habit of befriending members of the liberal clergy, the answer is basically twofold. On the one hand, Twain, as a frustrated gospel preacher himself, who disliked religious orthodoxy, was drawn to various forms of liberal religion he encountered from Hannibal to Hartford. And on the other hand, as a humorist with higher literary aspirations, Twain was drawn to liberal ministers like Thomas Starr King, who influenced the emerging national literature in America at that time. In the decades leading up to the Civil War, liberal Christians had two significant influences on American culture. One was the effort by liberals like Unitarian minister Theodore Parker to recapture the essence of what he called real Christianity that Jesus taught in the gospel versus the institutional, traditional religion that grew around what Jesus taught over the centuries. At their best, the early liberal Christians aligned themselves with what Jesus and prophets like Isaiah did. They condemned self-serving human religiosity that got in the way of fulfilling what they believed to be God's kingdom. Another way that liberals, especially Unitarian Christians, influenced American culture before the Civil War was in their literary preaching style. Sermons have always been a significant literary genre in America, going back to Jonathan Edwards. By the 19th century, many Unitarian preachers were moving beyond fire and brimstone sermons and becoming more a part of a literary vanguard of a new creative style of preaching that wasn't bound by promulgating church doctrine from the pulpit. With their liberal theology, they felt freer to draw from the aesthetic sources, from more aesthetic sources beyond scripture and doctrine, to explore individual spirituality and things going on in the culture in their sermons. And this creative, innovative preaching style is credited with influencing the likes of Whitman, Melville, Emerson, and others. And to this august group, I would include the humorous literary sermons of Mark Twain. That is AI, by the way. Twain had a lifelong sympathy for religious liberalism. That second quote in particular, I think, really captures the essence of what James Freeman Clarke said that religious liberalism was all about: revitalizing the individual's direct, first-hand experience and knowledge of God beyond what non-examiners, as Twain called them, passed on generation after generation. Now, as I've alluded to, Twain admitted that when he was younger, he had a strong ambition to be a preacher of the gospel. While visiting his hometown for the last time in 1902, he said he desired earnestly to stand in that Presbyterian pulpit and give it instruction. He also said that he saw preaching as something that wasn't just done from the pulpit by a preacher, but from the mouths of all of us. That's where the preaching goes on all the time. As early as 1865, he confessed to his brother Orion that his two most powerful ambitions in life had been to be a riverboat pilot and the other a preacher of the gospel. I accomplished the one, he said, and failed in the other, because I could not supply myself with the necessary stock in trade, i.e. religion. Now, this ironic distinction between the gospel and religion harkens back to me to what Theodore Parker was saying about the real Christianity versus the doctrinaire forms of religion that got in the way of the gospel that Twain said he wanted to preach. And as late as 1906, at a time when some see Twain sinking into an embittered atheism, he admits that I have always preached, and that humor was always a secondary importance to him. And looking back over his career, he reflected that was why he had lasted 30 years as a humorist. Now, where most popular humorists of his time came and went, Twain only grew in popularity over more than 30 years, and he remains a cultural icon well over a century after he died in 1910. There's Ron Chernow's new best-selling bio. I heard he was here and had a good turnout. Hal Holbrook's Mark Twain Tonight now is being performed by Richard Thomas. The Mark Twain Riverboat in Disneyland's a big attraction. Percival Everett's new book retelling Huckleberry Finn from Jim's perspective, and even rock songs, most famously Rush's Tom Sawyer. And he even lives on in social media, as this meme demonstrates. That's actually something that gets passed around a lot, in my circles anyway. So, in my opinion, it was Twain's lifelong preacherly impulse, couched in a theologically liberal sensibility, that made him popular, but also got him into trouble early on with the Orthodox establishment of his time. This can be seen in an example from the 1860s when Twain was rising as a national writer. His newspaper correspondence from his tour of Europe and the Holy Land were very popular here in the States, but it offended some, like one straight-laced Orthodox minister who did not like Twain's harsh ridicule of some of the sacred sites that he visited while in the Holy Land. And the minister went so far as to condemn Twain from the pulpit as a son of the devil. Now, Twain's defense was steeped in the religious liberalism of his era. He said, "I would have shown this minister how much real harm is done to religion by the wholesale veneration lavished upon things that are mere excrescences upon it, which should be torn from it by reasoning or carved by it by ridicule." Why? Because, according to Twain, sounding very much like a preacher here, they provoke the sinner to scoff when he ought to be considering things about him that are really holy. Now, in tracing Twain's early influences that were the foundation of his religious liberalism, I examine in my book a few of the influences Twain encountered while growing up in Hannibal. And tonight I'll touch briefly on 3 of them, just in sake of time. There was liberalized Presbyterianism in Hannibal. There were the very unorthodox views of Twain's own family members. And there was, as I mentioned earlier, Twain and Freemasonry. Now, Hannibal's religious landscape has something of a bad religious reputation among some Twain scholars. Van Wyck Brooks in the 1920s described the frontier town as the barrenest spot in all Christendom. More recently, Ron Powers characterized the chilly Calvinist theology of the Presbyterian church Twain attended as, quote, the untranscendentalism of the early 19th century, with no cheery vision of liberating faith built on the divinity of the personal soul. However, Alexander Jones and others have pointed out that there were many heterodox undercurrents in the town's religious life when Twain was growing up there, and most of them were within his own family. His father was a freethinker. His uncle was a Universalist. His brother Orion was an abolitionist known for his ever-evolving unorthodox Christian views. When he was excommunicated from one church, Twain remarked, "It's funny to see them excommunicating Orion. They'd better have saved themselves the trouble. He'll be a deacon in the same church next year, and a deacon in some other church the year after that." And there were also other liberal influences on the Presbyterian church in Hannibal. Deistic Enlightenment notions of nature's God were actually subtly creeping into the church's hymnal. There was a schism between New School moderates and Old School Calvinists in the Presbyterian church nationally, which led to the Hannibal church splitting into separate congregations. And Twain and his family attended the moderate New School church. And another influence was Thomas Paine's Deistic Age of Reason, which contains very brutal critiques of organized religion in general, Christianity in particular. And Twain said he initially read it while he was learning to pilot riverboats on the Mississippi, and he did so, he said, with what he called fear and hesitation. Now, his reading of Age of Reason might have been influenced by Freemasonry, which has often been at odds with religious orthodoxy. When Twain joined Polar Star Lodge 79 in St. Louis in 1860, the lodge had a large number of riverboat pilots among its members. So I've wondered, I've never found any connection, but I've often wondered if maybe one of the brothers at the lodge invited Twain to read Paine's book. Now, Twain's brother Orion, who had campaigned for Lincoln in Missouri during the 1860 election, was named by the new administration as its Secretary of the Nevada Territory. Shortly after becoming a Mason, Twain left with Orion to go out west with his brother. It's during this time on the harsh landscape of the western frontier where many scholars see Twain losing what little religion they believe he may have had. But it's interesting to me that someone supposedly becoming so disillusioned with religion would have developed so many friendships with Freemasons and liberal Christians while living in Nevada and San Francisco. Along with friendships he made there with Freemasons, he would later dedicate Roughing It, his account of living out west, to fellow Mason Calvin Higbee. I present evidence in my book suggesting Twain may have actually attended a few more Masonic meetings in Nevada and California lodges than we were originally aware of. He also befriended several popular liberal ministers in Nevada and San Francisco. In particular, the literary sermons and dynamic preaching of Unitarian ministers Thomas Starr King, who was also a Mason, and the nationally prominent Henry Bellows, and the poetically inclined Presbyterian minister Charles Wadsworth had a serious literary impact on him. Now, Twain praised the radical Episcopalian Franklin Rising's ministry for elevating Nevada's rough frontier mining community from what he called its pristine state of semi-barbarism. A few years later, when he heard that Rising had been killed tragically in a shipping accident, Twain glowingly told Livy how he used to try to teach the refined and educated Rising how he ought to preach in order to get to the better natures of the rough population about him in the mining community. In one of the funniest passages, in my opinion, in his book, Roughing It, Twain comically captures how the well-spoken Rising could not understand, to save his life, the rough vernacular spoken by a slang-spouting miner. It's a sort of who's on first style dialogue between the two. But it ends with the miner actually converting to Christianity eventually, and he even goes on to teach Sunday school using the mining lingo. Nationally known Unitarian ministers Thomas Starr King and Henry Bellows also had a significant literary influence. Both were hugely popular preachers in California, and King in particular packed churches and halls with his entertaining and engaging literary sermons that were often laced with humor. Bellows was the editor of the Christian Examiner, an influential literary review at the time on the national level. And as a minister who recognized humor's theological significance, Bellows was also a big fan of Twain's humorous newspaper writings at the time, so much so that he encouraged the aspiring humorist to write a book. I make the case that Thomas Starr King in particular was a significant influence on Twain as he was emerging as a writer. Not generally mentioned in Twain studies, Starr King isn't, I include evidence that King and Twain were friends and that Twain thought very highly of him. After King died abruptly in 1863 of pneumonia at the age of 39, Twain eulogized the beloved minister as a great and good man who is gone from our midst, and noted the tenderness and goodness of his nature and all the power and grandeur of his intellect. As a Christian, a Unitarian, a Universalist, and a Freemason with a nature-based mystical theology and a good sense of humor, King checked a lot of boxes on the liberal religious checklist. Originally from Boston, he was nationally recognized as following Emerson in erecting the Lyceum lecture platform into a kind of free pulpit, merging showman-like entertainment with preaching lively literary sermons. When popular humorist Artemus Ward brought his lecture tour to the Western frontier, he not only befriended Twain while he was there and became an important influence on his development as a humorist, he also recognized that Thomas Starr King had great popularity in California, and he made sure to invite the minister to join him on stage to help market and give his show a nice turnout. This photo here demonstrates Starr King's great popularity in California. A crowd is gathering outside a lecture hall in California where King was to speak against slavery. Now here we enter some familiar territory, I believe, both in Twain studies and here in Elmira, especially with Thomas K. Beecher. Just as Thomas Starr King and the liberal ministers on the western frontier were key to Twain's development as the wild humorist of the western slope. These three prominent Eastern preachers were influential in shaping his persona, I think, as an author on the national scene. Perhaps they lacked Starr King's showmanship, but their brand of Christianity could be as unconventional as the Unitarians Twain knew in California. But with their more genteel Northeastern sensibilities, these clergy, along with Olivia Langdon, helped to smooth the rough edges of Twain's more freewheeling literary preaching style that he learned out west into a more respectable guise. It's well known in Twain studies that Twain was close friends with Thomas Beecher, of course, who served here in Elmira for decades, and with Joe Twitchell, the conservative progressive preacher of the church Twain regularly attended in Hartford. And Twain also considered Horace Bushnell, who mentored both Beecher and Twitchell, to be the greatest theologian of the 19th century. It's not surprising then that he would feel this way about a highly unorthodox minister who was charged twice with heresy and exonerated both times. Now, Bushnell embodied the liberal attempt to keep Christian faith claims vital in an age increasingly racked by doubt. Prayerfully embracing your religious doubts for him was a key tenet of his theology. He preached, "We live just now in a especially doubting age. Science puts everything in question, and literature distills the questions, making an atmosphere of them. All truths of religion are only what are called probable, never necessary truths like the truths of geometry or of numbers." And despite these doubts, Bushnell asserted that prayerfully exploring them will ultimately bring us into a deeper encounter with God. He said, "We grope, the groping is doubt. We handle, we question, we guess, we experiment, beginning in darkness and stumbling towards intelligence." All three ministers, there are many things I go into in the book about them and their influence on Twain, but all three of them primarily influenced Twain's literary preaching, I believe. Along with Twitchell, Twain belonged to the Monday Evening Club, which was a prominent literary group founded by Bushnell. He admired Thomas Beecher's pulpit eloquence, as he called it, and keen intellect, and his preaching style that the rector of Elmira's Episcopal Church praised as presenting plain, simple gospel sermons, with no effort to be grand or eloquent, no rhetorical flourishes, no straining after effects, nothing high-flown or sensational, that nonetheless produced a great impression, which I would have to say would apply to Twain's best writing as well. Those characteristics would. It was also well known that Joe Twitchell and Twain both influenced each other in literary ways. Twain inspired sermon topics for Twitchell, and Twitchell suggested story ideas for Twain. As a friend of Twitchell's from Yale observed, Twitchell often furnished in the rough jewels which afterwards in Mark Twain's workshop became perfect gems. So on the spectrum again of liberal religion in America, Twain starts off closer to the Unitarians in the middle that he knew in California, whose popular literary preaching styles helped him, I think, to see how he could transform that frustrated ambition he had to be a preacher into a lucrative calling as a humorist. Then, as he courted Olivia here in Elmira, he left his Unitarian friends and Freemasonry behind and moved closer toward the devout evangelical end after meeting Bushnell, Beecher, and Twitchell, which deepened his liberal religious sensibilities while helping him to smooth some of his rougher edges into respectability. And from the late 1870s onward, roughly speaking, I see him moving far over to this end of the spectrum, the far end of free religious people who had very different ideas about the purpose of religion. Twain's friend Moncure Conway, as I mentioned earlier, was very much the embodiment of this sensibility. This was the radical end of the spectrum, consisting of liberal ministers who, like Emerson, moved away from Unitarian Christianity. Many had been hardcore abolitionists who, emboldened by the, quote, triumph of the constitutional abolition of Negro bondage, unquote, now saw the time was right to liberate religion itself from every sort of thraldom to irrational and merely traditional authority. Now, Moncure Conway was one such radical. Although he's often seen in Twain studies as Twain's literary representative in England, Conway is also recognized on a larger scale as the most thoroughgoing white male radical produced by the antebellum South. Although he was a staunch abolitionist and very egalitarian in his politics, he was actually from an aristocratic slave-owning family in Virginia. He attended Harvard Divinity, where Emerson became his mentor, and Conway actually considered Emerson his spiritual father. He became ordained as a Unitarian minister. Eventually, he would become an expatriate in London, a member of the Free Religious Association, and the minister of a free thought congregation in London, which consisted, as one contemporary source at the time put it, of rich city families, graduates of Oxford, and the president of the Royal Society of Philology. And, this is an interesting note, the extreme left in politics as well as in religion. In terms of God, Conway said he believed that, and this is a quote, instinct constrains us to render homage to a superior principle generally understood to be by the notion of God. So he had a very nebulous way of appreciating the divine, but he did believe that there was something, just maybe not the traditional way of understanding that. And in terms of Christianity, and especially Unitarian Christianity, which he was a part of, he had given up on both entirely. As he put it in 1876, Unitarians of England and America have done their utmost to make Christianity consistent with truth and freedom, but they have shown it is impossible. So in my book, I trace how I see Conway's criticism of Christianity, his interests in very esoteric and obscure things like demonology and Hinduism, all influencing many of Twain's writings thematically, such as in the biting criticisms of Christianity in the latter half of Huckleberry Finn, which is in contrast to Bushnell's religious optimism that I see informing the first half of Huckleberry Finn. That's one of the things I delve into in the book that I wrote. And others would include, with his interest in demonology, Satan in Letters from the Earth and other stories that include satanic characters, and especially in the conclusion that nothing exists in number 44, as I will demonstrate in a moment with that one. But to understand how it gets to that point, that my conclusion is, we can look first to Twain's evolving notions of God. In my book, I trace Twain's evolving views of the divine throughout his life, beginning with his early Christianity and Freemasonry, and concluding with his later interests in aspects of esoteric Hindu notions of God. And here are some examples. In terms of Christianity, although Twain would eventually reject Jesus as divine, early on he did revere his divinity. In Innocents Abroad, he wonders what the brothers of Jesus thought about their older sibling, who was to others a mysterious stranger. That's an interesting phrase there. A mysterious stranger who was a god and had stood face to face with God above the clouds. Despite all the claptrap sideshows and unseemly humbuggery of every kind that he found in the Holy Land while he was there, Twain was still awed by the sight of the crucifixion, where he wrote how something grand, reverend, venerable had taken place. A God had died there. In terms of Freemasonry, I'm not a Mason. I don't know the inner workings of Freemasonry, just from what I've been able to study. But my understanding is that in order to join a lodge, at least when Twain was a member in the 1860s, the main requirement was that initiates had to profess a belief in God. Not necessarily the Christian God, but a God. Masons generally believe in the great architect of the universe, a universal, non-denominational understanding of the supreme being who created the universe, which allows Masons from all different faiths to be brothers in the fraternity. Now, Twain was still a Christian at the time and had an appreciation of the Bible, as evidenced by this picture of a gavel he donated to his lodge in St. Louis after touring the Holy Land. It's made from a piece of the cedars of Lebanon, which has Masonic biblical significance because King Solomon used these cedars to build his temple and palaces. Still, Twain agreed with Albert Pike, a significant figure in Freemasonry, who recognized the handiwork of the great architect, the artisan, the mathematician, who transcends the Alps in the smallest molecules of a leaf or an ocean or a human being. And then, when it comes to Mark Twain and Hinduism, I am not saying that he became a convert, although he did say in his autobiography that he revered the Hindu god Juggernaut, or Jagannath, as they would say in India. I think that he, like many intellectuals, Emerson, Thoreau, Moncure Conway, who had lost faith in Christianity toward the end of the 19th century, he was drawn, like them, to the more esoteric aspects of Hinduism. Albert Pike, also in Freemasonry, drew from Hindu notions of God and his understanding of the divine. And Moncure Conway is considered one of the popularizers of Hinduism in America during the 1870s. And Pratap Mazumdar, the fellow with the beard there, also knew Conway, was a friend of his, and he was basically a Hindu version of a Unitarian. Pratap had a lengthy visit with Twain in Twain's Hartford home during his lecture tour of America in 1883, after writing a book entitled Oriental Christ, which was a reinterpretation of Jesus and Christianity from a Hindu perspective. And the picture in the middle there, on the bottom, is of Twain's friend Nikola Tesla, whose scientific understanding was deeply influenced by the form of Hinduism promoted by Swami Vivekananda, who is over there in the darker turban in the corner. And this naked man there is Swami Sri 108, whom Twain met during his 3-month stay in India during his world lecture tour in the 1890s. Which brings me back to the supposedly nihilistic conclusion of number 44 I talked about earlier, the one that asserts nothing exists and everything is a dream. When you compare what Sri 108 believed in the top quote and compare it with number 44's conclusion, you can see a very clear thematic parallel. Sri 108 held that ultimately the world is not real and that the world is but a dream. Twain also says as much. What's often left out in discussions of Twain's supposedly grim conclusion in number 44 is that the mysterious stranger, like Sri 108, or even Jesus, the mysterious stranger in Innocents Abroad, wants to set us free, set the narrator of the book free as well, from this insane dream we're all in, with its pains and griefs and troubles, so that he is now, the narrator and those of us who would follow, empowered to go on and dream other dreams, and better. And there's a lot more I go into in my book about the conclusion of number 44 and Hinduism, and how I see the mysterious stranger definitely not in this version a satanic figure, but more of a divine avatar. But the basic insight I'll leave you with tonight is this. I believe, contrary to claims that Twain was an embittered atheist in the end, he was, I think, still seeking that religious, liberal, direct, first-hand encounter with the divine, as he was considering 4 years before he died, the real God, the genuine God, the great God, the sublime and supreme God, the authentic creator of the real universe, whose remotenesses are visited by comets, only comets unto which incredible distant Neptune is merely an outpost. The God, he goes on to say, by comparison with whom all the other gods, whose myriads infested the feeble imaginations of men, are as a swarm of gnats scattered and lost in the infinitudes of the empty sky. So thank you very much for your attention.